consumed by diseases of their own consanguinity, the most deformed family in Alabama. Hidden among the isolated valleys and dense forests of Winston County, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there existed a family whose name still sends chills through the local population. The Blackwoods were known not just for their voluntary isolation from the outside world, but also for the terrible genetic legacy carried for generations. This is the story of how the intertwining of family blood led to one of the most genetically deformed lineages ever documented in the American medical history of the 1950s. The Blackwood case came to light in April 1957 when a rural doctor named Dr. James Harrington was called to an emergency on a remote property in the hills. What he found would change forever his perception of the limits of human degradation. On that property of about 40 acres lived approximately 32 people, all belonging to the same family tree, distributed among 3 small wooden houses. "What I saw that day will haunt me for the rest of my life," reported Dr. Harrington in his medical records, later released after his death in 1983. There were children with atrophied limbs, adults with distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies that repeated in virtually all the family's younger members. The Blackwood property was about 14 miles from the nearest town in Winston County, a location so remote they rarely received visitors. Even mail carriers avoided the area, leaving correspondence in an improvised box on the main road. The family patriarch, Elijah Blackwood, then 67 years old, was known for his hostility toward strangers and the rigid control he exercised over his descendants. The Blackwoods lived off subsistence farming, growing corn, potatoes, and some vegetables on rocky and unfertile land. They raised pigs and chickens, going to town rarely to buy essential supplies. The isolation wasn't just geographic, but also cultural and genetic, an isolation that had begun 3 generations earlier with the arrival of the first Blackwood to that region around 1880. Dr. Harrington was called to attend to Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl in complicated labor. She was both granddaughter and niece to Elijah, the product of a union between his daughter and his own brother. The baby was born with severe malformations, including polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, microcephaly, an abnormally small head, and congenital heart problems that led to its death just 48 hours after birth. This tragic event was just the starting point for discovering an alarming case of family consanguinity extending for at least 4 generations. The practice of marriages between close relatives had become an unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods, justified by Elijah as a way to maintain the purity of the family blood and protect their lands from outsiders. The initial investigation revealed that of the 32 family members, 27 presented some type of physical or cognitive anomaly. Among the most common conditions were severe facial deformities, including underdeveloped jaws and malformations of the palate, reduced stature with adults rarely exceeding 5 feet 3 inches in height, intellectual disability ranging from mild to severe, vision problems, including partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of members, congenital heart diseases, and limb malformations such as fused or extra digits. Dr. Harrington's notes describe William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, then 42 years old, as having an asymmetrical face with eyes set far apart, a significantly underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal curvature of the spine that made him appear much shorter than he actually was. His wife and also first cousin, Sarah Blackwood, presented coarse facial features with a widened and flattened nose, thick lips, and small, deep-set eyes. Of the couple's 6 children, 4 presented severe intellectual disability, unable to articulate complete sentences even as adults. The most disturbing aspect, according to the doctor's reports, was how the family seemed to accept these conditions as normal. They don't see these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic, he wrote. When questioned about marriages between close relatives, Elijah responded with disconcerting naturalness, "It has always been this way and always will be." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These dark stories of isolated communities reveal truths about our humanity that few have the courage to confront. You won't want to miss any of our next cases, documented with the same care and depth. The story of the Blackwoods becomes darker when we look at their origins. Historical records indicate the first Blackwood to arrive in that region was Isaiah Blackwood around 1880, fleeing accusations of crimes never clarified in the state of Tennessee. Isaiah brought with him his wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a small son, establishing himself in the remote mountains of Winston County and deliberately seeking isolation. A local census from 1890 already recorded that the family had grown significantly, with 11 members living on the same property. What the records don't explicitly show, but later investigations revealed, is that this growth didn't just occur through new members arriving, but through the birth of children resulting from relationships between the family members themselves. Letters found on the property dated 1910 show rejected correspondence from distant relatives who tried to maintain contact, with handwritten responses by Isaiah, "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only bring corruption to our lineage." From the third generation, approximately in 1920, the first evident signs of the genetic impact of this practice began to emerge. Local medical records, although scarce due to the family's reluctance to seek assistance, show births of children with increasingly severe malformations. Dr. Ernest Miller, a doctor who occasionally attended emergencies in the region during the 1930s, documented in his personal diary, "I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child presented a condition I had never seen before, multiple malformations in the limbs and face, and an almost animalistic behavior from the mother who refused to let me properly examine the newborn. The child's father, who I discovered was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of atypical facial development." The Great Depression of the 1930s only intensified the isolation of the Blackwoods. While many rural families in Alabama were forced to migrate to urban centers for work, the Blackwoods entrenched themselves even more on their property, surviving through subsistence farming and hunting. This period also marked the beginning of Elijah's leadership, who took control after his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's command, the practices of consanguineous union not only continued but were actively encouraged. Local school records show that the few Blackwood children who came to attend the county school in the 1940s were withdrawn after a few months. A teacher from that time, Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, recorded in school reports, "The Blackwood children demonstrate significant difficulties in learning and socialization. In addition, they present distinctive physical characteristics that make them targets of ridicule by their peers." After complaints from Elijah about the treatment his children and nephews received, they stopped attending. The isolation wasn't just a matter of personal choice, but also a response to growing stigmatization. Residents of the region developed an almost superstitious fear of the Blackwoods, with exaggerated stories about their appearances and behaviors spreading throughout the county. Deformed creatures living in the mountains or the cursed people of the hills were terms commonly used. In 1945, a significant incident occurred when two young Blackwoods, Joseph and Daniel, cousins and also half-brothers, went down to town to buy supplies. Their appearance caused such a commotion that they were chased out of the local grocery store by frightened customers. The local sheriff, Thomas Walsh, recorded, "The boys did not demonstrate aggressive behavior, just an extremely unusual appearance, eyes set very far apart, protruding jaws, and a form of communication almost incomprehensible between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to avoid further confrontations." This event only solidified Elijah's determination to keep his family completely isolated from the outside world. In the following years between 1945 and 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, with the exception of Elijah and his oldest son, Robert, who occasionally went down to buy essentials like salt, ammunition, and tools. World War II, which led many young men from Alabama to enlist or be drafted, did not directly affect the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly due to their physical and intellectual conditions and partly due to their invisibility in official records. Many births and deaths within the family were never registered, creating a phantom population existing on the margins of American society. It was in this context of extreme isolation, social stigmatization, and consanguineous marriage practices established for generations that Dr. Harrington found the family in 1957 when called to assist in Martha Blackwood's complicated birth. When Dr. James Harrington returned to town after his first contact with the Blackwoods, he faced an ethical and professional dilemma. As a doctor, he immediately recognized the classic characteristics of a population with a high rate of consanguinity. But he also realized he was facing an extreme case that could contribute significantly to medical knowledge about the genetic effects of these practices. After discreetly consulting with colleagues from the University of Alabama, Harrington gained the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar, though less severe, cases in isolated European communities. In June 1957, 2 months after the initial incident, the two doctors returned to the Blackwood property, this time with a carefully planned approach. "We couldn't simply arrive and announce our study intentions," wrote Thompson in his subsequent report. "We approached by offering free medical assistance and medications, knowing the family had little or no access to regular health care." Initially hostile, Elijah Blackwood eventually allowed the doctors to examine some family members, especially after realizing his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that weren't healing properly. This opening, albeit limited, allowed the doctors to initiate what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated U.S. population. Over 3 subsequent visits, always under the pretext of medical follow-up, the doctors managed to collect crucial data: partial medical history of 27 family members, anthropometric measurements of 19 individuals, photographic documentation, with reluctant permission, of 12 members, and blood samples from 8 people for basic laboratory analyses. The technological limitations of the time did not allow for the sophisticated genetic tests available today. But even with basic methods, the results were alarming. Blood analyses revealed high levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, a clear indicator of consanguinity. "What we are observing in the Blackwoods," wrote Dr. Thompson in his 1957 notes, "is a dramatic amplification of recessive traits that would normally remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, creating a cascade effect resulting in the severe physical and cognitive manifestations we have documented." Among the specific conditions identified were Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, in at least 6 members, polydactyly, extra digits, in 11 individuals, intellectual disability in approximately 70% of the family, ranging from mild to profound, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members, hemophilia in 3 men, and retinitis pigmentosa, progressive retinal degeneration, in almost 40% of individuals. The study also revealed an alarming infant mortality rate. Approximately 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not survive beyond the first year of life. Those who survived often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout childhood. One of the most impressive cases documented was that of Samuel Blackwood, 19 years old, son of William and Sarah. The young man presented a rare combination of conditions: severe microcephaly, an extremely underdeveloped jaw, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to light and shadow perception, and a stature not exceeding 4 feet 7 inches. Despite these physical limitations, Samuel demonstrated surprising musical abilities, being able to reproduce complex melodies on the banjo after hearing them only once. Cases like Samuel's represent the complexity of human genetics, Thompson observed. Even in conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression. During one visit, Dr. Harrington managed a deeper dialogue with Abigail Blackwood, 52, Elijah's sister and one of the few in the family who had significant contact with the outside world in her youth. Abigail revealed she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville when young, returning only when her father fell ill. "They don't know what they're doing to themselves," she confided. "I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within." Have you ever wondered what secrets isolated families hide on their remote properties? Leave in the comments. The mountains hold truths that society prefers to ignore. Your participation helps us continue bringing these impactful stories that few have the courage to tell. In August 1957, the doctors presented their preliminary findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, maintaining the family's anonymity for ethical reasons, referring to them only as Family X from northern Alabama. The presentation caused considerable interest in the regional medical community, but also raised ethical questions about intervention. "We are facing a population that voluntarily isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for subsequent generations," argued Dr. Thompson during the conference. "As health professionals, do we have an obligation to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy even when it results in severe genetic damage?" The fall of 1957 marked a turning point. After the conference, the case attracted the discreet attention of Alabama state public health authorities. The health department, concerned with the implications, sent a small multidisciplinary team to assess the situation, including a social worker, a public health nurse, and a legal representative. Their arrival at the Blackwood property in October 1957 was met with open hostility. Elijah, wielding a shotgun, initially refused them entry. Dr. Harrington's mediation, having gained minimum trust, was necessary. "You have no right to interfere in how we live," Elijah shouted, as later reported. "Our land, our rules. We've been here for 3 generations and nobody ever cared about us before." The public health team documented precarious living conditions, absence of running water or electricity, rudimentary sanitary facilities contaminating the water well, and general hygiene conditions aggravating existing health problems. 5 school-age children received no formal education, and several members had treatable medical conditions neglected for years. The official report by social worker Margaret Collins described, "We found a family living in conditions that go back a century, both materially and socially. The children show evident signs of chronic malnutrition, aggravating congenital conditions. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases like severe dental infections and chronic respiratory problems without any intervention." The situation presented a complex dilemma. On one hand, there were clear violations of child welfare and public health laws. On the other, forced intervention could traumatize an already fragile community. After intense deliberations, the health department opted for a gradual approach, starting with offers of immediate medical assistance and education. However, unexpected events accelerated the process. In November 1957, a strong storm hit the region, causing a landslide that partially destroyed one house. 2 family members were seriously injured and transported to the county hospital, the first time many younger Blackwoods had left the property. This incident provided authorities an opportunity to intervene more directly. While the injured received treatment, social workers talked with other family members who accompanied them, including 3 teenagers curious about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16, with less severe facial deformities but mild intellectual disability, expressed her desire to properly learn to read. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker. "But I want to know what's in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what's written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some younger members, combined with the practical need for assistance after the landslide, created a breach in the decades-long isolation. In December 1957, an agreement was negotiated. The county would offer materials to rebuild the house and ongoing medical assistance in exchange for permission for school-age children to receive basic education from a visiting teacher 3 times a week. Elijah reluctantly accepted, mainly due to pressure from other adult family members who had glimpsed the benefits of outside contact. This small concession marked the beginning of a slow transformation. The designated teacher, Esther Jenkins, 58, an experienced educator of isolated rural communities, began her visits in January 1958. Her personal diary, later donated to the county archive, offers an intimate glimpse. "My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge like no other in my 30 years of teaching. 5 children between 7 and 16, non-literate, all with some degree of cognitive and physical disability. But what impressed me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world denied to them. Little Timothy, 9, with his extra fingers and asymmetrical face, spent almost an hour fascinated with a globe I brought. 'Are we really so small in the world?' he asked with eyes wide with astonishment." Throughout 1958, the regular presence of teacher Jenkins and occasional health visits began to have a noticeable impact. 3 children learned basic reading. Chronic conditions were treated. Gradually, Elijah's initial hostility diminished, though he maintained his distrust. A significant turning point occurred in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose complicated birth initiated the discovery, expressed her desire to leave and seek treatment for her persistent health conditions. At 17 and now literate thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's classes, Martha understood her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer as we have," Martha told Dr. Harrington. "If what you say is true about our problems coming from marriages between relatives, then I need to leave here. Martha's decision to leave, accompanied by 2 teenage cousins, triggered a family crisis. Elijah initially threatened force to prevent them, but the intervention of the local sheriff and Dr. Harrington's mediation resulted in a tense agreement. The young women would be allowed to leave as long as they remained under social worker supervision and maintained regular contact. This event marked the gradual dissolution of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations. In the following years between 1958 and 1965, more than half of the younger family members chose to leave the property, many seeking medical treatment or integrating as possible into broader society. The early 1960s witnessed profound changes. The property that had been an isolated enclave for almost 80 years began to gradually open. Elijah Blackwood, the inflexible patriarch, faced not only the loss of his absolute authority but a reality contradicting everything he had believed. In January 1962, Elijah suffered a stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed and dependent on care, a situation ironic for a man who had valued independence and isolation so much. Under the care of his sister Abigail and with regular medical assistance, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at 77. In his last years, Elijah witnessed transformations he certainly considered the destruction of his way of life. William, his eldest son, assumed leadership and, influenced by new ideas, began implementing significant changes. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, gaining basic plumbing and electricity in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year. Younger children began attending local school, albeit with special support. Dr. Walter Thompson, who began his studies in 1957, followed the Blackwood case for over 2 decades. In 1972, he published a seminal article in the American Journal of Human Genetics entitled Multigenerational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama. The article, using the pseudonym Alpha Family, meticulously documented genetic effects over 5 generations. Thompson's work became a reference in population genetics, contributing significantly to understanding the effects of prolonged inbreeding. Among the significant findings were the progressively more severe expression of recessive conditions with each generation, the emergence of rare condition combinations, a dramatic reduction in fertility and birth viability in recent generations, and the occurrence of unexpected characteristics, like specific talents amid widespread disabilities. The study also documented health and development improvements in younger members after the 1957-58 intervention. Children receiving adequate nutrition, care, and education showed better cognitive and physical development compared to older siblings, demonstrating the powerful impact of environmental factors even with significant genetic predisposition. A particularly notable aspect was the follow-up of the young women who left in 1958. Martha Blackwood eventually settled in Birmingham, received treatment, and learned basic sewing skills. Though never completely independent due to her limitations, she found purpose in a craft program for people with disabilities. In a 1975 interview with a local newspaper, Martha, then 34, reflected, "I was born where we didn't know there was another way to live. We believed we were as we should be. Now I understand much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my parents or grandparents. They did what they believed was right. But I'm happy our story can help others understand the risks of this kind of isolation." Other Blackwood children had varied outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were placed in specialized institutions. Others achieved surprising social integration, especially those exposed to education earlier. The Blackwood property gradually decreased in population. Of the 32 members present at Drive Harrington's first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. The land was partially sold, with a small central portion still occupied by descendants. The case had ramifications beyond the immediate family. In the 1970s, it influenced public health policies in rural Alabama, with specific programs developed to identify and assist isolated communities. Health professionals received training to recognize signs of consanguinity and address the issue sensitively. In medical schools across the southern U.S., the Blackwood case study, always presented with pseudonyms, became part of the medical genetics curriculum, dramatically illustrating the risks of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Thompson frequently commented that the story of the Blackwoods is both a lesson in genetics and a lesson in humility for medicine. A reminder that entire communities can exist on the margins of our health systems, facing suffering that could be mitigated. In 1980, a University of Alabama documentary team received permission from William Blackwood, then 65 and the last of Elijah's children still alive, to create a historical and educational record. The documentary, Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, was produced with sensitivity, maintaining anonymity and focusing on medical and social aspects instead of sensationalism. One eloquent participant was Rachel Blackwood, then 39, who had become an informal advocate for disability rights in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the strange, the different," she said before the cameras, her face with distinctive features but undeniable dignity. "They don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, dreams, fears. What happened is a tragedy that could have been avoided with knowledge and support. I hope others can learn from our experience." The genetic legacy continued, albeit diluted. Younger members who left and formed families did so with unrelated partners, resulting in a rapid decline in severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study by Dr. Thompson in 1985 documented 43 direct descendants living across Alabama. Of these, about 30% presented mild to moderate genetic conditions, a dramatic reduction from the almost 85% observed previously. "The case of the Blackwoods," wrote Thompson in his final conclusions, "demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of the human genome. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we observed significant improvements. However, certain conditions persist, reminding us of the lasting impact consanguinity can have across generations. The original property, reduced to less than 10 acres, remained occupied until 1992 when the last resident, Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62. The land was sold, and the original structures eventually demolished. Today, few physical signs remain. Visiting the site today is a silent experience. The mountains and forests remain indifferent to the human drama. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the site. On this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity. The last known descendants are now dispersed, many with new surnames, integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some maintained contact, united by kinship and shared experiences few outsiders could fully understand. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of the initial discovery, the University of Alabama School of Medicine held a symposium on genetic isolation and public health. Among speakers was Michael Thompson, son of Dr. Walter Thompson and also a geneticist who inherited his father's research. "The case of the Blackwoods is not just medical history," he stated. "It's a study on how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies. It's also a story about how compassionate intervention can alter trajectories that seemed inevitable. 50 years later, we are still extracting valuable lessons. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is educational. Their experiences, documented with scientific and ethical care, continue to teach new generations of health professionals about the impacts of consanguinity, the importance of genetic diversity, and the challenges of assisting isolated communities. The story also confronts us with profound questions about cultural autonomy versus human welfare, the limits of isolation in modern society, and how practices established for generations can lead to unintended, devastating consequences. For the few who know their complete history, the Blackwoods are not remembered only for the physical deformities that made them objects of medical study, but for the human resilience demonstrated in facing extraordinary circumstances, and for the courage of those like Martha and Rachel who dared to question established traditions and seek a different path. In a very real sense, the Most Deformed Family in Alabama offers us not just a case study on the dangers of consanguinity, but also a mirror to examine our own attitudes toward difference, our prejudices and fears, and our collective capacity both to cause suffering and to alleviate it through knowledge, understanding, and compassion. If you watched this far, you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all the way through, so I can get to know who really enjoys the stories here." Don't forget to like to support our work and share this video with those interested in these real stories revealing dark aspects of the human condition. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any of our upcoming investigations into extraordinary cases like this one.